Hello, I am Adam O, and welcome back to the fourth and final part of how to draw a white cat. I think I did it. I made a title. It's not the title we deserve, but it's the title that we're going to settle for. So today we're going to finish this entire drawing up. We may have to do a little bit of fast forwarding because there's going to be a lot of this area that is going to be just straight up tedious. And once we know how to do the main part of the patterns and whatnot, you'll get the idea, and we can just kind of blast through. But we'll get to that just in a little bit. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So right now, all I'm going to do is I'm taking a dirty Q-tip, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I'm just dropping in the main shadow along the top left-hand part of the cat's body. We're not going to worry about detail here because if I were to start drawing in with a pencil or even a blending stump individual clumps of hair or fur, what's going to happen is that's going to make the fur look kind of wiry, and it's going to add too much detail, which is going to pull focus away from the cat's face. So what I'm doing is just using a Q-tip, and if I use just a Q-tip along this area, the fur will look fluffy and soft. So that's kind of what we're going for here. We're just worrying about the shape of the shadow. We'll worry about the tone and the darkness of the shadow in just a little bit, but we're just dropping that in just to kind of shape that cat's body out. Now when you see my hand disappear off screen, what I'm doing, and I'll have to show this on camera at some point, I've got a scrap piece of paper, and all I've done is I've just drawn and scribbled in a big blob in extra soft charcoal. I've just, a big, like a quarter sized or even bigger blob of extra soft charcoal. And then what I do is I scrub my Q-tip into that the same way that you would kind of, put paint on a paintbrush. We're just putting charcoal on a Q-tip. That dirties that up, and then what I can do is use that as its own pencil and very lightly start laying in charcoal using the Q-tip. And then as the paper pulls more and more charcoal off of it, then I can start increasing the pressure that I'm using with the Q-tip, because it's naturally going to get less charcoal on it as I put more charcoal on the page. So when you first do it, don't just dive right in and start scrubbing hard unless you're doing a really dark area. Just start light and then build up pressure as you lose charcoal from the Q-tip. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm dropping in that shadow. I'm kind of purposely keeping it light because I don't know how dark I want to go with this just yet, but I do know that I need specific shapes to be there. It's kind of crazy how it's almost like a magic trick to see that cat's body start to appear, and we've used no pencils here, no blending stumps. All we've done is just scrub that in with a Q-tip, and all of a sudden the shape of the cat's body is just appearing. That blows my mind. I've been doing this since like 1976, something like that, with like a big 20-year break in the middle where I just gave up art. But anyway, doing it even that long, it still blows me away how quickly those come together and how it just kind of tricks your brain into thinking there's detail there when there actually isn't. So now that I've got those shapes put in there, all I'm going to do is kind of sharpen up. I'm going to put air quotes here. Air quotes sharpen up the edges of that cat's body just by kind of putting a dark ridge with that Q-tip. We don't go into huge detail there, but I didn't want it to just kind of fade away. I want to give myself a border to work in, but I don't spend a lot of time there. As soon as that's in, I'm going to go into the tail so that I can fill out more of this paper, and psychologically to myself, it will feel like a lot more of this drawing is done. The more paper I can fill out here, the better, because I need the motivation. So I want to put the little stripy shadow that happens toward the end of its tail, just drop that in quickly, and then start pulling in a little bit of a very light gray tone along its tail, because it's a tiny bit darker there than it is on like the really white parts of its face. So I just want to drop that in just to get it there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm not going to put a lot of detail in. I'm just going to drop it in just to fill out some paper, and then we're going to move on to the next part. Now I want to start dropping in some of the background here. because this is going to be the most tedious part. And notice the cat's body is mostly white, so we don't have to do a lot more work to the cat's body. It's mainly just finishing touches that will finish out the cat's body. The main shape of the cat's body will be dictated by the background. So what I'm going to do is dive in and get the blackest of the black parts done with extra soft charcoal, and then start blending those in. And I'm not going to put a bunch of detail in this either, for two reasons. One, it's going to be a blurry background, or we're going to at least add some blur to it. And two, I mentioned a lot that as we get further away from the focal points and further into the distance on a drawing, I tend to remove detail to make it just a little bit more artsy, and to force the people's focal point in an area that I want it to land on. So in this case, I want the focal point to land on the cat's eyes. If I make the background too sharp, then people are going to focus on the background and it becomes a point of interest. So therefore, I'm going to make it blurry. I'm going to make it, it mainly only exists because a lot of artists won't do the backgrounds. And I'm telling you, as honestly as I can, the things that make my drawing stand out more than like the average artist is I will do the boring stuff that they won't. A lot of artists will do just the cat and no background because they don't want to mess with the background. But I can do the same exact drawing with the same exact skill set, and if I do those extra details like that, that's one of the things that makes my drawings look more like a quote-unquote photo. So anyway, we're just doing real simple shapes here. I'm just looking at the background, figuring out where there's these kind of big stripes of black, and I drop those in. And then when I go to do the texture of the blanket itself, like the little knitted holes that are in there, or woven holes, I'm not taking a bunch of, I'm not making a big effort to put those exactly where they are in the original photo. Just like a lot of this drawing, I just want the idea of that to be in there. So I'm going to do some very, very basic just scribbles with black extra soft charcoal in basically the same direction that it is in the reference photo. I'm not worried about getting the shapes so exact that they perfectly match up, because what I'm going to do is go back over this with a Q-tip and or a blending stump and just smudge all this stuff together. So you can see here I grabbed a Q-tip and I'm just blending all of that together, including the white space in between those little knitted parts, because the extra soft charcoal that exists on paper here will just push and smudge and move into those areas, so there's no need for me to shade those with a pencil. I'm just moving charcoal all over the page. Then I kind of fine tune it with a blending stump. And since that's so far in the background, the only real ideas that I'm concentrating on here only exist in order to shape the cat's face. Where that stops is where the edge of the cat's face stops. That's why that exists. You'll see by the end of this drawing how dramatically that makes the cat pop out. Now I'll do the same thing with, there's another ridge that lies below that. And I'm just kind of, the only reason I'm even taking any sort of care in this section at all is because this is going to be a little section that sticks out a little bit more than the others. So what I'm doing here is I'm laying that in with extra soft charcoal with a very, very light touch. And then I'm going to go back with hard charcoal and I'm going to start putting in a little bit finer details. I say finer details, but they're not really. I'm just kind of shaping that little ridge. I drop that in and then I'm going to blend it out yet again with a blending stump. And what I'm concentrating on here is the little light reflection that happens back in the back. You can see that, running horizontally, that it sticks out a little bit more than the rest of the highlights. But when we concentrate on putting a big black strip along the bottom of that, when we blend that all in, it'll look like the blanket folds and rolls over on itself. And that's the main idea that we're going for here. Just dropping in a little bit of texture using a blending stump, but I'm not getting detailed. Again, just dropping it in just so it exists. And then lightly with a Q-tip, I'm just going to blend over that entire area. I don't care if I lose detail here. Now, since I'm working on an area that is really, really dark, that's what's fresh in my mind, is laying in those super dark areas. So I want to continue that thought process on the other side. You'll notice that on the left-hand side, the areas that I just did, that's really the last big black dark areas that exist until you get down into the cat's full-on shadow. So I want to leave that alone, and then I'm going to pop over to the right and start laying in those big sections of black that appear there. My mind is already on that, and so if I continue that, I'm not breaking my train of thought. I'm not putting myself in a different mood. I'm continuing the same process over and over, so it becomes almost more like factory work. It's doing the big black section on the left, then move to the big black section on the right, and then those become more cohesive. The other reason that's important, and maybe this is only important to other artists or maybe just to me, but it seems like if I were to move on and do the entire left-hand section of the drawing and get it out of the way, and then I start on the right-hand section, I may have developed, just by pure accident, another technique in the middle of all that. And then the right side will look different than the left side, but only slightly. Maybe the people who are looking at the artwork won't notice a difference, but I will, and other artists could possibly notice it. So anyway, I'm just keeping the same train of thought, same techniques, move on to the right, start laying those in, and it just becomes, to me, more cohesive. So again, notice how I'm laying in that big black strip that goes off to the right. And instead of getting detailed with these little woven strips, I'm not counting to find out how many there are. I'm not making sure the spacing is exactly right. I'm just scribbling in lightly with extra soft charcoal the idea of that pattern, because I know that I'm going to go blend it and all this stuff is going to fuzz out in the background anyway. So as long as I've got that idea there, I'm happy with it. Now we could take a ton of time and make this exact. We could count how many dots there are. We can kind of measure out the spacing. We can figure out the exact angle of each of these little dots and strips and stripes. But that's not really what I'm paid for on this drawing. This is a commission. And what they're paying for is a realistic drawing, but they're not really paying for like hyper realism. If we were going for hyper realism, this drawing would take 10 times longer. And so this is kind of also a lesson in how to get, realism without spending just a massive amount of time on it. In the next video series that I do, it's way more realistic than this, and it's way, way more detailed, but it also took way more time. So anyway, you'll see that coming up next week. But anyway, I'm just continuing what I was doing. I noticed a basic pattern in the blanket, and I'm just kind of lightly mimicking that and moving on without getting too engrossed in those details. Then I want to move up to that stripe, because that stripe is like the easiest thing to do, right? It's just one big solid block of black. So I just kind of rope that off with a line, finish off the pattern that I was working on, and then jump up into that big black strip there and just quickly drop it in. If you've ever drawn a black section of a drawing, and when you're done, it doesn't look solid. It looks like it kind of, I don't know, you can see the scribble marks in it. One way to get rid of that is to, I want to say color that in, but that's not what we're doing. We're going to fill that in using circles rather than back and forth strokes. Beginning artists, their natural kind of reaction or their natural instinct is to scribble back and forth horizontally because the strip itself is horizontal. But that's going to leave massive pencil marks. So what I suggest is using a little less pressure and use a little less speed, and instead just make little circle marks and concentrate on making those smooth. If you go back and forth, you're going to increase a bunch of pressure, you're going to go really quick, and it's going to have extraordinarily obvious pencil marks. The smoothness is not going to come from our actual pencil strokes here, especially since we're using circles and not, back and forth swipes. It's going to come from the circles and also the blending method that we use. The blending method is more important to me than the actual pencil strokes. So you can see when I get to this right hand side here, I'm just quickly adding circles. I'm not worried about pinholes. I'm not worried about whether these, totally, completely overlap or not. I'm just using a light stroke to make it smooth, and then I know that my Q-tip is the thing that's going to make that solid. So then that's what I'm going to do here. I'm taking a dirty Q-tip. It doesn't matter if it's clean or dirty. It's just I'm using an old Q-tip because I know this is going to be blurry and not detailed. And I'm just going to use, again, circles. And I'm going to blend the things that I've already drawn into the things that I haven't. And in that way, we're moving charcoal into areas where there are no there is no charcoal, and that's going to automatically add those mid-tone grays that we need for that area without having to use a pencil. Then once I get all that blended away, I just take the Q-tip and go over the entire thing, just blend it all together. Now look at the difference between the section I just did versus the stuff that's at the top that's not blended yet. There's quite a bit of difference there. You can see all those pinholes and it looks all grainy and just unfinished. But the second I start blending that all together, that will appear to get darker, even though you're kind of moving charcoal around and even taking it off in areas, simply because the white pinholes disappear. That's, again, another thing that just blows me away. It just looks like magic. Then I pull that up into the section the same way I did below, into the section where there's no charcoal, because now that's going to automatically fill that in with mid-tone grays or dark grays, and it's going to make it look there like there's a little tiny bit of a light reflection on top of that. Now after you do this, if you're noticing that there are still pinholes there because a Q-tip won't completely blend that out, you can further refine that by grabbing a blending stump and just kind of scrubbing that all together as if the blending stump was a pencil. And that will fill in even more charcoal into those pinholes and make them just almost completely disappear. It basically pushes that charcoal down into the ridges of the paper. Now I'm still operating on the idea of leaving those whiskers as negative space, but I've almost given up on it. Thank God, because again, I've mentioned it several times. It was a bad idea. I shouldn't have used negative space here. If you're watching this for some reason, part 4, but haven't seen any of the other 3 parts, what I should have done is completely filled in the background without negative space where you can see the whiskers. And then at the very end of the drawing, just drop those in with a Tombow eraser, which is a 2.3 millimeter eraser that operates like a mechanical pencil, and just erased away those areas where the whiskers are. Now I could have done this little section with a Q-tip. However, once we start getting around the side of this cat's face, our right side of the cat's face, I need to be careful to not overlap too much into the fur. I need that to be a little bit sharper than the rest. So I'm just using a blending stump to blend in this area because I need the same thing to happen along the tail. The tail is going to be blurrier, so it's not as important here to have a sharp, clean edge along the tail. But since I already have the blending stump in hand, it doesn't make sense for me to bounce from blending stump to Q-tip, back to blending stump. I'm just going to blend the whole area with the blending stump just to make sure that I don't overlap too much into the cat's face. Now you can see just by laying that in very, very quickly, suddenly the cat's face closes off and becomes an entity. And we can now tell that there are certain sections of the right-hand side of its face that are going to need modifying in order to correct a little bit of the shape, in order to show that there are little hairs that poke out from its fur over the background. And we can see that much more clearly now than we could before. Now I'll go back into the side of the cat's face, and I'm just kind of dropping in little hairs that poke out over the background just by grabbing the side of its face and pulling outward. And that's going to erase away part of the background but make it look like these little hairs are jutting off of the face itself. Now in the video, it's not going to look as impressive as it does in real life. In real life, that looks extremely thin, and they pop out. They become a part of the focal point. So I hope one day I'll be able to get a better camera so you all can see much better what this looks like and have a better representation on video as it is in real life. But that's further down the line, and we're talking like I would need 100 patrons in order to do something like that. While I'm doing this background part over here, if you happen to know anyone who wants to learn about art, if you happen to know people who just like watching people do art, I would greatly appreciate it if you could pass along this patron as a suggestion to people. I'm starting to build up a little bit of an audience on YouTube and a little bit of an audience on Twitter, but the more patrons I have, the better the more time I'm gonna be able to spend on stuff like this to teach people how to do what I do. I won't spend a lot of time on that. I don't want to turn this into an infomercial. That's just not me. But anyway, I'm going to take a dirty Q-tip, and we're going to lay in a mid-tone gray pretty much over this entire area. So the great thing about this part here is that this is the part that's not only going to shape the cat's body, but there's a very simple pattern that we can do to make this look more realistic than it actually is. And it all just starts with laying in a little, mid-tone gray with a dirty Q-tip. So I'm just going to drop that down real quick. I don't care if it's clumpy because the blanket itself is clumpy. You can see what I mean if you look at that's not a solid gradient in this area that I'm doing. It doesn't look real smooth. If it looks too smooth, it's not going to look like cloth. It's going to look like metal or wood. So I'm fine with that, getting a little bit clumpy. Now I'm going to start working on that basic pattern that I mentioned a minute ago. If you look at that left-hand section, there is like a diagonal squiggly set of lines that line up with each other and go off into the background. As they get further into the background, the softer they become. They become more defined the closer that we get to the camera. So again, we're not going to take so much time and effort that we're drawing out each individual little hole in the blanket and each little fiber. That's not what this is about. We're about creating a less detailed background that accentuates the foreground. And so I'm just dropping that in kind of quickly with a blending stump just to get the idea of those in there. Now, if we need to darken those up, we can later, but if we do, I would be using not extra soft charcoal, but hard charcoal, because when we blend that out, that's more of a gray than a black. The blacker you get, the more detailed it looks in pretty much anything that I've personally drawn. And so if I were to use extra soft charcoal in this area, it would look like the shadows are too hard and it would draw attention away from the cat. So anyway, what I'm doing is instead of using hard charcoal, I'm using a blending stump because that's naturally going to be softer and lighter than your regular charcoal. And as we're dropping these in, we're not really worried about the lines that would go in the opposite direction. We're just worried about the ones that pop out to us in the reference photo. When you first look at that, basically all you can see is a diagonal line that goes from the top left to the bottom right, and they all just kind of squiggle around each other. That's all I'm worried about. Now, just like with pencils, the thing that I suggest would be always start with a light touch. Whether you're doing pencils or you're using blending stumps or a Q-tip or whatever, always start with a light touch first, And that will give you a baseline to know what that light touch is going to produce on paper. And then you can always darken it up later. So it's just kind of a safety measure. If I were to get a ton of black charcoal on this blending stump, and then I go in, just and start slapping that sucker down with really black marks, it's going to be too black and it's going to look awkward. So I'd rather start light first and then build up darkness as we go along. The only time I really deviate from that is when I'm doing jet black shadows. So once we get into this jet black shadow on the bottom left-hand corner of the drawing, then it's a different story. Then I can, go like crazy and start slapping dark black in there as much as I want without worrying about it. But the blanket deserves a little bit of finesse because it is going to be a secondary or tertiary, I hope I'm saying that word right, focal point. Basically, if we do this correctly, people will notice the cat's eyes first, then probably its nose or its mouth, and then their eyes are going to pop back to the background. So now all I'm doing is I'm taking a blending stump, and there are little waves in that blanket that are just shadows of the overall blanket itself. So there's basically 2 or 3 triangles in there of just ripply shadows. So all I'm doing is I'm laying that in there, and then I'm thinking just about the shape of those shadows, and then we can modify that later if we so desire. Now we're going to be covering more area than what we would, with as compared to the blending stump. So I'm just going to grab a Q-tip and start blasting this stuff in there. Again, no attention to detail at all. All I care about is laying in mid-tone grays, making sure the whole area is covered with gray, and making sure that those little extra shadow areas are in the right places and in the right direction. But at no point do I stop and start being finicky with this at all. I just want it slapped in there. Now, one of the things that I do in my drawings, in every drawing that I do, is I make a decision. Do I want this to look super bright, super dark? Do I want the contrast to be low or high? And the answer is almost always, I crank the living crap out of the contrast, because I want dark darks and bright whites. And so this is one of those areas where I have to make a decision. Do I want this blanket to match the really dark tone that it is in the reference photo, or do I want to lighten that up and make it look more glowy? So what I do is I err on the side of caution. I put it in lightly first. Then if I decide that I want to darken that later, I can. It's the same thing with the cat's face. You can see that shadow on the left-hand side isn't anywhere close to being as dark as it is in the reference photo. And that's by design, at least for now. I want to know if it looks better to me if it's light, or does it look better if I drop in some really dark shadows later? And the safest way to pull that off is to start light and then make the dark decision later. It's so much easier to add charcoal rather than take it away. So now that I've got the idea of that blanket in there, the absolute easiest thing that I can do right now is drop in that really dark black shadow. So I just outline where I want that to be and just go to town with extra soft charcoal. Again, I'm not, using pencil strokes that are up and down or side to side. I'm making circles. The blending just looks so much better and so much smoother when you use circles as opposed to, flat strokes. The only part that I'm going to take a little bit of care on is right along the edge of the cat's leg, because I'm going to have some hairs that pop out of there. And I don't have to, completely outline those with negative space, but I do need a couple clumps of those to be kind of defined. So I just kind of scratch those in with extra soft charcoal and leave the negative space in place. Then once I have those, now it's time to jump in and just go crazy with extra soft. When you see me blend this in here in just a minute, I know I mentioned, I know I say this a lot, but it's another one of those magic trick moments. Whenever I start blending this in, it just goes so much darker than what it appears right now, because right now there's so many pinholes poking through because the divots in the paper on like a microscopic level, those little valleys that create the texture of the paper won't allow charcoal into them doing what I'm doing now with a pencil. But it will allow them in once we start scrubbing that in with a Q-tip. We'll be pushing piles of charcoal into those little divots, and that's what makes it look darker, and also what makes it look smoother. Now again, using circles and not up and down motions or side to side motions, just start blending that in. The thing that I'm concentrating on while I'm blending this in is getting rid of pinholes, and I'm thinking in my head, smooth, smooth, smooth. We're not really looking for anything else other than smoothness. Now, another thing to keep in mind while I'm doing this is the drawing in reality is not nearly as bright as what it appears on video. So there's going to be a lot of sections, and I know I've talked about this before, so I really apologize for repeating myself. But there is a lot of this drawing that looks like, oh my God, you need to darken that so badly. But in real life, the drawing is darker than what it appears here. So these videos are going to give you a pretty good idea of what I'm doing, but they're not true to life. And so if you ever watch me doing this stuff and you're thinking, man, he's screwing that up, it's not necessarily that. So now using that Q-tip that we just used to blend in all that black, it's now extremely dirty. And so rather than just let that go to waste, I'm going to go back up into the texture of the blanket on the left-hand side, and I'm just going to start making dots with extremely black charcoal that's on the Q-tip. And that's going to give a fuzzy representation of the holes in that blanket, and it's going to define those a little bit better than what I have them. Then as more and more charcoal gets pulled off of the Q-tip, I can use it to define the shadows that are on the left-hand side. Now we'll just kind of modify those little ripple shadows that happened in the blanket. We'll just darken those up a little bit, give them a little bit more definition and a little bit more direction. And all I'm doing is, again, no pencils, no blending stump. All I'm doing is using the Q-tip as my pencil. Now this is also where I made the decision that yes, that was too light. So I want to add at least another layer of charcoal here to darken that up just a bit. And again, just like with all the rest of the drawing, if we decide we want it darkened later, we can, but we don't want to push ourselves over the line and go too dark. Now I'm going to use a trick with a paper towel here. I just fold this over, and in order to make this blend in all together and look even blurrier than it is now, I just fold that over and pull straight down over that entire background. And that's going to add a layer of smoothness, and it's going to add a layer of blurriness to that background. You don't have to go crazy with that. In fact, there's a lot of people that would be afraid to do that. I'm just not, because if I don't invest myself mentally into that background and I just keep telling myself it's only there to accentuate the foreground, then I'm not afraid to go back in and try different things with it, like the paper towel trick. Now using the Q-tip, I'll go over the edge of that bottom shadow so that it doesn't look like it just cuts itself off. And then I'll pull some of that shadow up into the texture of the blanket. into those little folds and creases that happen into it. And it'll blur out the shadow itself and give it a sense of gradient that most shadows don't just stop on the edge. They have just a little bit of blur and gradient and fade to them on the edges. Now there's some sections of the blanket down on the bottom part, almost in the center, that they're not entirely black. There's little pieces of the blanket that pop up and catch light. So that's why I didn't go solid black all the way to the bottom of the paper. I want to have those little sections of light pop out and be a little bit more defined than the rest of the blanket. And that's going to make it look like, psychologically, it's going to make it look more detailed than it actually is. So I just drop that down with, extra soft charcoal, blend it in roughly with a Q-tip, roughly and lightly. Then just blend that all together, and we're going to trick people into thinking there's detail there, even though there's just not. Now I always try to think, after I blend in some really dark charcoal like that, I always try to look at the drawing and think, is there an area where I can use this really dark charcoal? Because I'm saving myself a little bit of pencil by using this in other areas. And one of the areas that definitely needs darkened up is the left-hand side of the cat's body, especially underneath its neck. And so I jump back up into that while I still have that Q-tip that dirty, and we're going to just start laying in some darker shadows along this section. When I say it saves me from wasting pencils, what I mean is if I run out of extra soft charcoal on my scrap paper, like I explained earlier, then I have to scribble another big section, another big blob with extra soft charcoal, which uses up a lot of my pencil. But since we were already blending this area with this really dark shadow, I'm doing the same thing, except I'm not doing it on scrap paper, I'm doing it on the drawing itself. So we're using what we laid down in the same exact way that I used the scrap paper method. Now we're using another trick here where I'm darkening up this shadow, but I'm using very deliberate strokes, the same way I would use if I were using a pencil. And by using those strokes like that, we're creating the illusion that the hair flows in that way, the fur flows in that way. Because the texture of the Q-tip, it's going to have these little hairs and little fibers that pop out. If we make light strokes across the cat's fur at an angle like that, those little fibers are going to act like little microscopic pencils, and they're going to incidentally draw little individual hairs. So that's one way we can kind of trick the charcoal into making detail there without us having to go back and with really tedious, meticulous strokes doing it with a pencil. We just let the Q-tip do that for us. Now while I'm in that area, I want to drop in that little triangular, like an upside down triangle shadow in this area where its feet, its legs cross over each other. One of the reasons I'm doing that is because this area to me looks so unfinished. It looks like I have so much paper left to fill out in order to finish this drawing, and psychologically it tricks me into thinking that we're nowhere close to being done. And so I want to drop that stuff in there, because once that's finished and I see the paper starting to get covered in detail, then it looks like we have so much less work to do. So it's a way that I keep myself motivated. So while I'm in the area, I drop in that little triangular shadow, and then I grab a blending stump and I start to fill out a little bit more of the fur that's got a tiny bit more detail than what you would get with like a Q-tip. So I start dropping in the little shadows along its legs. I jump up around its collar and start adding in little clumps of fur that may be a bit darker than the rest. And again, I'm using the same method where I guess I didn't do a blending stump. I apologize for that. I'm still using the Q-tip, but again, the method's still the same. I pull down in a very specific direction in order to fake detail. The shadows get lighter along the right hand side of that big giant clumpy shadow there. So now I'm worried about putting in a little bit more detail with a Q-tip. I'm also worried about smoothness. I'm worried about shape. But this is all basic refinement really at this point, because notice the majority of the cat's fur in this area is pure white. So all I'm doing is adding some detail with a Q-tip just to fill in that space and get it done, get it off my plate so that I can make myself feel like, okay, this drawing is almost done. Now, once we have that dropped in, we can grab a blending stump and a Tombow eraser and just go back in and start dropping in little clumps of fur, little clumps of highlights and whatnot. And we can refine that just by, zipping in these little lines. Again, we don't want to worry about a ton of detail here, because if we get too tedious with it and we get our brain locked into the idea that we want to make this ultra realistic or hyper realistic or whatever, and we want to make it super, super detailed, we're then forcing ourselves to make the entire body of the cat using those real minute details. If we did that, we would spend 5 times longer on this drawing than we need to. So we're only doing that in just little hit and miss sections just to get them in there, just so that they exist, but we don't want to permeate the entire drawing with those. Now, whenever I get into the cat's chest, where you got these just a couple rolls of fur that create little horizontal shadows there, it's kind of amazing that it only takes a few strokes with a blending stump to drop those in. All I do is I drop them in quick and dirty using up and down strokes, and it'll just create the illusion that that's fur. And then I just use kind of the same techniques to quote unquote sharpen up other sections of the side of the shadows that poke into the bright glowing white of the rest of its fur. You just drop those in quickly, roughly, and then move on. And just if you went any sharper and you went into that with pencil, it's going to be too sharp and it's going to ruin this effect. So don't be tempted to start going up through here with a pencil. Leave it alone with a blending stump, because the blending stump is as sharp as you want these clumps of fur to be. And if this is the sharpest level that you go, then the fur itself is just going to look softer, fluffier. It'll make you want to reach out and pet the cat. Now on this right hand side, all we're going to do is the same exact thing we did with the left hand side. So I'm going to buzz through this pretty quickly. All we're doing is grabbing some extra soft charcoal for the darkest areas. All the rest of the areas we're basically going to do with hard charcoal, just to get those little dots and those little, textured holes put in there. And then we're going to go back over it with a Q-tip and just blend all that stuff together. Then once we get that dropped in, that's going to define the body of the cat. So then all we have to do is go back into places like the foot and drop in our little shadows to make it look just even more defined. And again, we're doing that with a blending stump because it's soft. We don't want hard pencil there. And that's going to finish out the whole cat. The only thing we need to do from there is just little fine-tuned touch-ups. I'll never not be blown away by how cool it can look whenever you learn to master the background and push that negative space into places and into shapes. That blows me away that background, even as rough and almost, undetailed as it looks, makes the cat stand out and look so much more realistic by contrast and comparison. So now, anyway, the last part we need to do here, or at least one of the last parts, is I just take a Q-tip and soften up the edges of the right-hand side of the cat, and then just kind of define, shadows that need darkened up here and there. This is all refinement stuff. It's all touch-up stuff. Going back and forth along the tail just to add some direction to those strokes, because the fur is going to flow in that direction in that area. So and since it's all out of focus, we don't have to worry about getting detailed there at all. So just quickly drop that stuff in, and that's it. Now, one of the last things I always do, and I say one of because there's one thing I do at the end of every drawing, but one of the last things I do is I always pop back up into the face and I put another layer of darkness over the shadows. Because as I add black to things like the background, it's always going to make the foreground look lighter, because you're directly comparing really dark black to really low tone, low contrast grays. So I always go back into the face and I give it another coat of charcoal just to darken that up a little bit and make it match a little bit better. Because I do want a lot of high contrast in these areas, but I don't want them so high contrast that the white washes out on the face and makes it look dull. So that's what I'm doing here. And then the last thing I always do is take my Tombow eraser and sharpen up things like whiskers and whatnot. But I think this is even more important than those last details, because this is what's going to make the cat's face pop out and have shape and dimension and have more of a 3D effect. And even on this camera that washes out a lot of this, darkness and brightens up areas way too much, even on this camera you can tell a major difference in darkening those shadows along the left-hand side of its face. That's pretty much it. The photo here at the very end is what is way closer to what it looks like in real life. And anyway, I wanted to thank you guys so much for watching along, and I really can't wait to show you the next video, because the next video in this series is going to be an actual masterclass on light and shadow, and it's way more detailed than the series you just watched. So I hope to see you there. And again, if you know anybody who enjoys stuff like this, please pass along the Patreon. I appreciate it so much. And even if you don't, thank you so much for showing your support, and I will see you in the next series.